everything is meaningless, and I don't think is, but I don't want to put words in his mouth. But as far as meaninglessness is concerned, it's very hard to apply this word to John's life. He's an educator and has published, this is his fourth book as far as I'm aware, and has been a musician and composer. So when you put all those things together, that's just part of his life, of course, but if you put all those things together, it's really hard to apply the word meaningless to it. But nevertheless, I hope John's going to solve that contradiction for us. So ladies and gentlemen, John Marmysz.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. The book, I don't even have a copy of it. The library doesn't have a copy of it, but the cover is right there. It's called Cinematic Nihilism, Encounters, Confrontations, and Overcomings. It's published by Edinburgh University Press, and it's distributed in the U.S. by Oxford University Press. It's really expensive. It's going to come out in paperback next year, so you might want to wait until then to get a copy of it. In any case, I prepared some remarks about the book. I'm going to give you kind of an overview about it, and then I'm going to take the time to read selections from the last chapter in the book. I did a poll of the students in various classes and asked them if they wanted to hear about zombies or if they wanted to hear about a crazy Japanese author who committed ritual seppuku in 1970. And I was surprised that the unanimous decision was everyone wanted to hear about the Japanese seppuku. So I'll read you selections from chapter 9 on Yukio Mishima. Is anyone familiar with Yukio Mishima? A few people. Okay, so you're in for a treat there. All right. Well, let me get started first with the overview of the book. So cultural critics commonly warn against the dangers of nihilism. Associated with the decline and the decay of our highest values, nihilism traditionally has been treated as an unequivocal evil, something to be resisted and overcome at all costs. Today, the popular media is frequently denounced as promoting nihilism, while critics regularly bemoan the corrupting influences of television shows and movies. This type of complaint stretches all the way back to Plato. Many of you are familiar with this complaint from the Republic, who famously condemned artistic representations as dangerous distractions from the real world that are 3 times removed from the truth, and which plunge spectators into a state of illusion and falsehood. So in my book, Cinematic Nihilism, I take issue with this viewpoint, and I contend that while many popular motion pictures are nihilistic, this is not an unequivocally negative thing. Instead, I argue that cinematic nihilism is potentially beneficial, reminding audiences of their moral condition and offering opportunities simply to explore this condition unencumbered by excessively static and inert conceptions of objective truth. So, a little bit of background on nihilism. The term nihilism was first used by 18th century authors such as Jacob Hermann Obereit, Daniel Jenisch, and Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi. These writers employed the term in protest against Kantian philosophy and its division of reality into noumenal and phenomenal realms. So the objective noumenal realm must always be filtered through and interpreted through mental concepts in order to be understood as phenomenon. And this division thus implied that the real world, separate from human interpretation of what Kant called the thing in itself, was unknowable by the human mind. So the idea here is that the human mind is almost like a computer program for Kant. And when you come to the objective world, this computer program of mind is constantly filtering and interpreting reality. And so the only thing that you're in direct contact with is the interpretation, but not the thing in itself that's being interpreted. Okay. So this separation is what critics claimed was nihilistic about Kantian philosophy. By reducing the objective world to a veritable nothingness, this type of nihilism was intolerable. It was a condition of distressing separation from real, objective truth, and nihilism was thus established as something to be avoided or overcome. Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger later developed their own influential accounts of nihilism, and following them, many contemporary critics came to emphasize the moral and existential consequences of nihilistic separation, which allegedly included despair, alienation, and meaninglessness, as we mentioned. So So in cinematic nihilism, I maintain that the negative consequences often associated with nihilism are not at all inevitable, and that in particular, the sort of nihilism in film is potentially positive and constructive. I argue that film is nihilistic in two related ways. First, there's what I call the nihilism of film, which consists of the necessary separation between cinematic images and the reality that those images reflect. So this parallels the distinction between phenomena and noumena that inspired the first charges of nihilism against Kantianism. This nihilism of film is often criticized by those who object that certain movies are unrealistic and thus deceptive and deceitful. So in other words, if you think of the images, the cinematic images themselves as like the interpretation, they're intended to reflect something outside of themselves, and that would be the thing in itself. And so there's a separation, like phenomena and noumena in Kantian philosophy. For instance, critics often criticize this movie, Trainspotting. Has everyone seen Trainspotting? Yeah. This movie was subject to a lot of criticism. It still is. By philosophers, media critics, politicians. Bill Clinton criticized this movie. Social crusaders. They think it glamorizes and thus falsifies the true horrors of heroin addiction. By the way, this is the character Renton, who's coming out of the worst toilet in Scotland. The film's images, these critics claim, are so artfully constructed that, like prisoners in Plato's cave, audiences are in danger of mistaking them for true reality with potentially awful consequences. Now, all of this is related to the second way that film can be nihilistic. While there's always a separation between film imagery and the reality that it reflects, often there's also a nihilistic message that's part of the film's internal storyline. So internal to the story, there might be a nihilistic message. So for instance, in this film, Trainspotting, the characters within the story reject mainstream values, actively disparaging the morals and standards of polite, civilized society. This is nihilism in film, sort of a moral nihilism that undermines established ideals. Cultural critics regularly complain about this variety of cinematic nihilism, seemingly worried that audiences will absorb the morally reprehensible standards of on-screen characters and thus harmfully degrade themselves, others, and the culture as a whole. Again, Trainspotting is still subject to this type of criticism. I was talking with a friend who recently who said that, yeah, I know people who emulate the characters in Trainspotting. They think they're cool. And he thought that this was morally nihilistic. Now, not all films are about nihilism, and so not all films are nihilistic in the second sense. However, as movie imagery always involves representation of an absent reality, all films are nihilistic in the first sense. But this is not necessarily a bad thing, for along with Aristotle, I believe that one of the virtues of art lies precisely in its imitative nature. Going to the movies is an active choice made by audiences who already know that the dramas that they're going to be watching are imitations, distinct from the things that they represent. In making this choice, audiences willingly engage in a nihilistic exercise of detached make-believe that creates a safe space, what we call kind of buffer zone, between themselves and the dangers depicted on the screen. In watching films with nihilistic content, audiences guard their own safety, which allows them the leisure to linger in consideration of the meanings and implications of the fictional dangers depicted on the screen. Thus, and this is the crux of the argument, it's the nihilism of film that encourages audiences to linger in the presence of nihilism in film. While imaginatively absorbed in the film world, audiences also know this world is an objective illusion. But it's an illusion offering an opportunity to encounter troubling and distressing issues of importance to real-life people. In this way, film potentially trains us to learn the lessons of nihilism, and these lessons may in turn be useful in real life. So that's kind of the core of my argument in the book. Now, one of the lessons that we can learn from nihilism is that our distressing separation from the highest ideals of aspiration has a productive potential, opening up a gap that makes room for activity and the endless ongoing pursuit of goals. Goodness and so forth, if nihilism is true, then there's no end to our aspirations towards truth being goodness and so forth, since such ambitions are mental projections that lack independent objective existence. They're abstractions, necessarily resisting concrete realization. We must always fall short. And yet, that also means that there's an unending room for improvement. and that there's always more to do. If, on the other hand, nihilism was overcome, we would at some point successfully possess the truth. We would become reconciled with absolute being, and then there would be nothing left towards which to strive. So in other words, if we possess objective reality, we'd have it. There'd be no striving, there'd be no struggle, there'd be no distress, certainly no suffering, because we'd be perfect, but then what do you do? Once someone heard someone talk about the boredom of heaven. Get to heaven, that's it. So as long as the distress of nihilism is an issue for us, we remain unsettled by our separation from our highest ideals and thus potentially retain the motivation to do things, staying active as we vainly push toward the completion of our most cherished projects. If we find that the process of pursuing these projects is inherently interesting and valuable, then perhaps nihilism is not such a bad thing, since it guarantees that this process will never end. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? So that's my introduction to the trajectory of the book, the main argument of the book. The 9 chapters in the Cinematic Nihilism explore a variety of international films in which encounters, confrontations, and overcomings of nihilism are depicted. The overall trajectory of this book illustrates the potentially negative consequences involved in overcoming nihilism, while highlighting the potentially liberating and creative consequences of remaining entangled in the ongoing battle with nihilistic distress. So this is contra to what the usual argument is. The usual argument is that since nihilism is so distressing, it needs to be overcome. And my argument is, because it's distressing, it need not be overcome. My conclusion is that it may perhaps be better to remain separated from our highest goals of aspiration rather than to fall into the sort of smug, totalitarian arrogance that goes along with believing we have successfully and finally come to grips with reality once and for all. The best nihilistic films remind us of this, so that we might guard against self-importance, overconfidence, and the desire to oppress others in accord with our own reified notions of absolute truth. So now I'm going to read you an excerpt from the final chapter of the book. And the final chapter of the book is titled Yukio Mishima and the Return to the Body. This excerpt will illustrate some of these themes. Yukio Mishima, as I said at the beginning of the talk, was a Japanese novelist, playwright, and filmmaker who his entire career was committed to trying to overcome nihilism, and he was successful. He finally overcame nihilism by disemboweling himself with a samurai sword, committing ritual seppuku. So this is Yukio Mishima. And again, this comes from chapter 9, Yukio Mishima and the Return to the Body. Yukio Mishima was a controversial Japanese author who, in 1970, disemboweled himself in an act of ritual seppuku. A self-avowed nihilist, Mishima devoted his career to finding a cure for his own lifelong spiritual alienation through an eccentric assortment of activities, including writing, bodybuilding, political action, and an antiquarian return to emperor worship and samurai ideals. Through the integration of art and life, he sought to transcend the decadence of his cultural inheritance, purifying and finally perfecting himself with a heroic death. In Mishima's life, work, and death, we find dramatic examples of the creative potential as well as the dangerous temptations involved in the struggle to overcome nihilism. Now, part of Mishima's wide international appeal came from his eagerness to embrace popular culture, including film, as a vehicle for the propagation of his own ideas and personality. In addition to writing for the stage, TV, and movies, Mishima acted in a handful of productions and also directed and produced the short film Patriotism in 1966, which was adapted from one of his own short stories. I think the library owns a copy of this. It's a Criterion collection. In Japan, many of his works have been made into movies, and in 1976, his novel The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea was produced in the UK as a major motion picture starring Chris Christopherson. Has anyone ever seen that one? Yeah, Twisted. It's a very twisted movie. In 1985, Paul Schrader directed Mishima Life in 4 Chapters, in which portions of Mishima's fictional and non-fictional works were dramatized in order to tell the story of the author's life and extraordinary death. Has anyone ever seen that one? It's probably more popular than the first one. So the case of Yukio Mishima offers a unique opportunity to scrutinize the complicated operations of nihilism on at least three interrelated levels of analysis. First of all, as he advocated and strove toward the unification of action and art, this is something he wrote about in his book called Sun and Steel, which is kind of like an intellectual autobiography. Mishima's involvement with literature, film, and the stage and TV highlights and dramatizes the obscure gap always lurking between representations and the reality that they purport to depict. Mishima's art was never just mere entertainment, but always evocative of the deeper existential struggles and issues with which he himself was engaged. This inevitably leads us to ask, how close do we get to the real Mishima through his works, including the films and the writings he inspired? We sense that there's an important relationship between the real Mishima and the words on the page or the images on the screen, but we also feel that such representations inevitably fall short of depicting the full nature of this truth. We feel that these artifacts must somehow represent Mishima and his ideas about the world, but just how well or poorly do they do so? In the case of an artist like Mishima, this always remains a question, and as a result, the ontological dimension of nihilism chronically and insistently intrudes upon our experience of the various works with which his name is associated. So these works that, his novels and the films that he was involved with, the imagery says something about the truth, but how close or how far is it from that truth? And this is the first type of nihilism, the nihilism of film. Secondly, as Mishima was himself a nihilist, there's a further ideological level to the literature and films with which he shares a connection. These works tell us something about how the man thought, reasoned, and felt, and so the content, no less than the form of these works, encourages us to meditate on the actual conceptual dynamics of nihilistic alienation and despair. In this, we're plunged into the philosophy of nihilism and the desire for its overcoming. As we follow along with this logic, we potentially come closer to a concrete understanding of how Mishima himself may have reasoned through the choices that ultimately led him to his unique end. So this is equivalent to the nihilism in film, okay, the message of the films and literature. Third and finally, in encouraging audiences to think through Mishima's step-by-step march toward perfected oblivion, his writings and the films with which he's associated offer cautionary examples of the potentially poisonous results that might occur as a consequence of being swept up in the enthusiasm to defeat nihilism. While Mishima's suicide can be seen as the culmination of his life project, the final step in his unification of action and art, it's also the case that it was this very act that brought his creative life to a close forever. In eradicating the nihilistic gap between his real life and the ideal for which he longed, Mishima also decisively obliterated his future potential. If the truly interesting part of human existence rests not in the successful achievement of our final goals, but in the process of ongoing creative struggle, then we might question Mishima's suicidal desire to overcome nihilism. Perhaps a life of unresolved contradictions, failed aspirations, and ongoing struggle has its advantages over a life in which success is connected to finality and the closing off of possibility. Maybe indeed nihilism is something that we should not seek to overcome. This is little Mishima. Kimitake Hiroka was born in 1925. He adopted the pen name Yukio Mishima at the age of 16 when his story, The Forest in Full Bloom, appeared in the literary magazine Literary Culture. It's a publication that was inspired by the right-wing nationalism of the Japanese Romantic school. The name Yukio Mishima was created by the editors of the magazine, who regularly met at an inn near the town of Shigenzi. To get there from Tokyo, a transfer was required to the town of Mishima. The word Yuki means bound toward, and so Yukio Mishima literally means bound toward Mishima. This turns out to be a fitting name for an author who would self-consciously spend his entire life working toward the formation of a unique identity for himself. In a way, he was bound toward Mishima up until the moment he died on November 25th, 1970. While initially expressing confusion as to why his story was to be published under a pseudonym, Mishima was also apparently relieved, as his father was not at all supportive of his son's literary aspirations. The adoption of the pseudonym then offered one of the first screens or masks behind which he might hide. Already at the age of 16, the young Mishima was becoming accustomed to splitting and segmenting his identity alienating one part of himself and his life from another. Now, previous to the adoption of this pen name, Mishima had already experienced an unusual degree of alienation in his family life. As a sickly and frail young boy, it was thought that he needed to be protected from physical hardship. Consequently, in a perverse attempt to shelter him from the dangers of the real world, until the age of 12, Mishima was separated from his mother and father and lived instead with his grandmother, who demanded that her grandson refrain from physical exercise or sports, avoid contact with other children, and spend most of his time indoors, tending to her needs. He lived in this unnatural manner, apart from his family and the world outside of his grandmother's supervision for years, until finally his grandmother became so incapacitated that Mishima's parents took their son back into their own home and care. His return home to live with his family was marked portentously by the commencement of hostilities between Japan and her neighbors, ultimately leading to the country's involvement in World War II. Mishima attended school and continued writing throughout these war years, publishing his first book, a collection of stories, in 1944. His father, who remained hostile to his son's literary pursuits, told Mishima at the celebration dinner for the book's publication that he shouldn't get too excited about his accomplishment, since "you'll soon be dead anyway." That's a quote. The conviction at the time was that all young Japanese males would inevitably die, either in battle or as a result of Allied bombing raids. Despite this expectation, Mishima survived the war. Ironically, his frail constitution seems to have saved his life. Because of his fragility and poor health, he was never inducted into the armed forces, and though he worked in the wartime factories, he escaped falling victim to the Allied bombardments. The end of the war arrived for Mishima when he was 20 years old, not as a relief, but as yet another challenging transition. He had become accustomed to living with the assumption that he was fated to die young, but with the war over, that assumption appeared to be faulty. Here, once again, we see that Mishima experienced a jarring incongruity between his expectations and reality. On the one hand, his own consciousness had been formed and given shape by the backdrop of the looming oblivion. On the other, he was now thrust into a world where that backdrop was torn away. The world failed to deliver what he had anticipated was his destiny, and now in a post-war world, he was set free to pursue an unknown future in a defeated country that was becoming increasingly westernized. Under the Allied conquest of Japan, the emperor was forced to renounce his divinity. Mishima wrote a poem about this that was equating it to what Nietzsche called the death of God. The emperor was no longer a god. The Japanese military was dismantled, and traditional Japanese cultural institutions were subject to control, suppression, and censorship. The nationalist literary movement, of which Mishima had been a part, predictably fell out of favor, and so his past writing efforts, the basis of his entire identity as Yukio Mishima, became anachronistic, part of a defeated and disgraced past. Thus, at 20 years old, Mishima found himself yet again thrust into a hostile and unfamiliar world. Both his psychological and his literary personae were out of place in this post-war environment, and so if he was to survive as a writer, he would have to enact yet another shift in self-conception. This shift came with the publication of his powerful and disturbing novel, Confessions of a Mask, in 1949. As Roy Starr writes, in a single stroke, the wartime romantic had turned himself into a post-war realist. And this book is considered to be his first, and it's considered by many people to be his best work of his life. And Confessions has consistently been interpreted by critics, one way or another, as an essentially autobiographical account of Mishima's own struggles with his sexual identity, beginning from birth and moving into young adulthood. It's often concluded on this basis that what we find in Confessions is as close as we ever come to encountering the genuine man, raw and honest in the revelation of his true inner desires, thoughts, and feelings. Consequently, critics regularly rely on Confessions as if it gives us a clear window into Mishima's real self. The biographer Henry Scott Stokes relies heavily on it as a single source for the author's early life. Marguerite Yourcenar likewise treats it as a reliable source for details about the traumatic episodes in Mishima's childhood. And there was a BBC documentary titled The Strange Case of Yukio Mishima, in which the narrator, John Hurt, reads passages from Confessions as if they're facts about Mishima's biography that are not taken from a novel. So this way of approaching Confessions of a Mask is dramatically illustrated by Paul Schrader's film Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters.
In that film, Mishima's childhood is visually depicted in black and white, a technique they use throughout the rest of the movie to highlight episodes that are supposed to be biographical rather than fictional. In the film's first chapter, titled Beauty, we see the young Mishima with his grandmother, his first instance of masturbation while gazing at a portrait of Saint Sebastian pierced by arrows, and also his military physical examination. The words that act as narration in these scenes from the film come from Confessions. And the use of black and white photography serves to compartmentalize and set them apart from the scenes drawn from Mishima's other literary works, suggesting that what we're seeing here is different and somehow more real than the novelistic fantasies constructed in some of his other books, like Temple of the Golden Pavilion, Kyoko's House, or Runaway Horses. In these other chapters of the films, the dramatized episodes are presented in color, with staging that highlights their non-reality. Titles intrude at the beginning of each chapter to remind us of the particular book that acts as the source material and its publication date. The scenes are enacted on literal stages. But this isn't so with the scenes featuring narration from Confessions of a Mask. The lack of titles or of artificial staging, along with the black and white photography, work together to produce a feeling of documentary verisimilitude that's absent from most of the other parts of the film, except for the framing scenes in which that depict Mishima's final days. Schrader's stylistic choices thus serve to mark the material from Confessions as different, indeed more biographically veridical than the material drawn from Mishima's other novels. Perhaps the recurrent inclination to read Confessions of a Mask as presenting a more real Mishima than do his other works is a consequence of the unflattering subject matter that the book contains. There's nothing heroic in Confessions. Instead, the main character is presented as despairing, self-loathing, and pitiable. The assumption that many readers, critics, and interpreters may understandably form is that since the book's written in the first person, and since it reveals such a convincing and yet unflattering portrait of the inner thoughts of the main protagonist, what's revealed here must be true. After all, who would falsely confess to having sadomasochistic, homosexual, and cannibalistic desires? Which is what occurs in this movie. Couple this with the fact that later, more clearly, in his more clearly autobiographical work like Sun and Steel, Mishima refers to some of the same facts about his childhood that appear in Confessions, and it may be tempting to draw the conclusion that this latter book really is a literal memoir of Mishima's life, rather than a work of fiction that merely takes inspiration from and only dimly reflects his childhood feelings and experiences. But the conventional readings of Confessions underestimate how much of the book really is a self-conscious yet incomplete attempt by Mishima to refashion his literary persona in accordance with Japan's changing cultural zeitgeist. With increasing westernization, popular tastes in Japan turned away from the old romanticism and moved toward a more modern form of psychological and existential soul-searching, like that popular in post-war European literature. By the way, Mishima was a big fan of Nietzsche, so he seems to have been inspired by Nietzsche. Mishima's book was clearly intended to fit in with this trend, a fact that he himself later comments on in Sun and Steel. And as a confirmation that the book did in fact fit in with the spirit of the time, shortly after its publication, 6 of Japan's top writers and critics selected Confessions of a Mask as one of the year's top novels. Now, while Confessions of a Mask does indeed take the form of a sort of Augustinian confession of sins, it also clearly, as the very title suggests, concerns the narrator's adoption of various masks, none of which ever perfectly fit him comfortably or correctly. In this regard, Naoki Inosa and Hiroki Sato have suggested that the quote-unquote perversions confessed in the story might perhaps themselves serve as masking cover for deeper, unstated, and more painful issues in Mishima's real life, like his unrequited love for Mitani Kumiko. If this is the case, then surely it complicates the widespread penchant for reading the book as a literal documentary account of Mishima's own life. In focusing on the narrator's sexual fetishism and sadomasochism, Mishima is really, if in focusing on these things, he's really engaging in a conscious act of distraction from his own preoccupations, then it might be a mistake to think that we come anywhere close to finding the real Mishima in Confessions. Perhaps the most that we can determine is that the author is someone with something to hide, and that what he has to hide is for him far more psychologically threatening than sadomasochistic homosexuality. And just a note here, this may sound weird, but I think people do this all the time. they make themselves out to be worse than they really are as a cover. And I think that maybe Mishima is doing that in Confessions of a Mask. In any case, there is something tremendously frightening, yet unstated, at work in this novel. Behind the narrator's admissions to perverse feelings and thoughts, one finds consistent, terrifying inner confusion, self-deception, and a general sense of meaninglessness. And this is a quote from Confessions of a Mask. The character states, "It was not my maturity, but my sense of uneasiness, my uncertainty that was forcing me to gain control over my consciousness. Because such consciousness was simply a stepping stone to aberration, and my present thinking was nothing but uncertain and haphazard guesswork." So everything the narrator confesses is, he tells us, merely a stepping stone. It's uncertain and haphazard. The voice in Confessions, it seems then, is the voice of confusion. It's a voice of someone who doesn't really know who he is, but who feels pushed this way and that haphazardly by drives and forces beyond his own control. I don't believe that there is any comfortably clear or unambiguous diagnosis that we can reach about either the narrator or about Mishima's true self from this book, precisely because the story's protagonist has no true self, doesn't have any true self at all. And this seems to be the novel's unspeakable message. The self is an illusion. There is no such thing as the real you. The character in this book just is a series of masks presented outwardly to the public. These masks find continuity with one another only because they're connected by an unfolding project bound toward an uncertain fate, bound toward Mishima, not by some underlying pre-existent essence. This shadowy, amorphous, far-off destiny can only become solidified, taking on finalized shape with the narrator's own extinction when there is no longer any future potential to be realized. Another quote from Confessions of a Mask, the narrator states, "It was in death that I discovered my real life's aim." I don't know if any of you have ever heard the phrase, "death, the night in blood." That comes from this book as well. A band called the Stranglers did a song by that title. So death is my final aim. Death is his aim precisely because death signals the end of life. And it's only with the end of a life that the multitude of masks, identities accumulated over the course of one's existence can be totaled up once and for all. The construction of an identity is an ongoing process for which death supplies the conclusion. Therefore, so long as one lives, there's no true self that's set, stable, and unchanging. At any point in time, a person's identity is merely another creative facade, conjured through artistry with words, images, and appearances. This is part of the line of reasoning that Mishima struggles to articulate in Confessions, a line of reasoning that becomes increasingly more lucid in his later works. In Confessions, readers are introduced to the narrator's embryonic awareness that the ongoing development of his self is characterized by a hopelessly strained relationship between the real and the ideal. And this is reminiscent of Plato's claim that the physical world is simultaneously a conduit as well as an impediment to the attainment of the highest ideals. The narrator of the story starts to understand that the existence of his body both allows him the opportunity to conceive of a perfected self, while also holding back and frustrating his non-physical aspiration toward the absolute. This awareness becomes manifest through the narrator's self-loathing, which is prompted by the tension between his own sexual arousal by men's brutalized bodies and his non-sexual platonic love for the pure spirit of Satoko, a woman. These incongruous inclinations cannot be reconciled with one another, and yet they're descriptive of how the character actually experiences life and comes to conceive of himself. As a maturing bodily organism caught in the grips of incongruous longings for sexual passion on the one hand, and longings for purity and spiritual perfection on the other, the narrator is a vessel of unease and distress. He needs the body in order to actually exist, and yet it's the body's finitude that separates him from infinite purity. The only resolution in this conflict would be, on the one hand, to abandon the aspiration toward the absolute, or on the other, to destroy the finite body. Later, in writings like The Temple of the Golden Pavilion and Runaway Horses, as well as in both the short story and the film Patriotism, it's the destruction of the body that accomplishes a final overcoming of this ontological incongruity. In Mishima's own life, it was his ritual seppuku that achieved the same goal. But in Confessions, there is no such resolution. In this work, the narrator's experience serves only to indicate the fundamental problem of human existence, that the construction of the self is a process in which embodied minds struggle, strive, and suffer toward the realization of ultimately unrealizable ideals. So this is why Confessions of a Mask is merely a beginning rather than an end in itself. It marks Mishima's first clear statement of his personal nihilism, marking a step in the construction of a philosophy that will allow him to make sense of who he is by discovering what he is not. He is not any one of the time and space-bound masks that serve to sum up his identity to the outside world. Those are merely finite conduits from the expression of his creative energies, and thus each of them is in the end an imperfect, expressive failure. Only the infinity of nothingness is perfect and absolute, summing up all contradictions. And while creativity thrives in the pursuit of this nothingness, it would also die if that nothingness were to be successfully achieved. Completed perfection implies the end of creative struggle, and thus realization of a final and fixed identity would also be accompanied by the extinction of the generative striving self. Now, this next section, just to kind of give some sort of resolution to all of this, I'm going to jump to the end of the chapter, which will describe his suicide. And this is a picture of Yukio Mishima with his private army. He collected together a number of university students. He got funding from the Japanese government in order to form this private army. They had 100 members in total. They were called the Tatsunokai, which means the Shield Society, and their goal was to shield the emperor. And as it turned out, it was this group that he brought with him to commit seppuku. Mishima's life came to an end on November 25th, 1970, after he and 4 students from his private army, the Tatsunokai, barricaded themselves in the office of General Mishita, commander of the Eastern Army. Mishima read a manifesto to the troops assembled outside of the office, hoping to rouse them to revolution. They were not at all moved, and he was driven back into the general's office by their jeers. Inside, he sat on the floor, and he committed seppuku, drawing his short sword left to right across his belly. And I'm going to spare you the gory details which appear in the book, but it was pretty gruesome. The vice governor of Tokyo, the present vice governor of Tokyo, applauds it and says it was magnificent. It was a magnificently committed seppuku. The actual details, well, I'm not going to spare you some of the awfulness. The actual details of the ritual were botched, failing to embody the sort of perfect ideal that Mishima had earlier imagined in his short story, Patriotism. For one thing, his student Marita, who's on your left, is the student on the far left, and Mishima's right in the middle. He had been tasked with beheading Mishima. He missed his mark, and he wounded his mentor in the back, intensifying and prolonging Mishima's suffering. Because of that, now he had disgraced himself, and he had to commit seppuku. So another student, Furukoga, who I believe is the one who's standing right next to Marita, I think he's to the right of Marita on your screen, stepped in to decapitate Mishima with one stroke, and then he also decapitated Marita, who had botched his own disembowelment. When he tried to commit seppuku, he lost his nerve, and he couldn't do it properly, and so he was decapitated. The serene joy and perfection that Mishima had imagined in his literary fantasy thus appears not to be reflected in the actual flesh and blood suicide. Mishima left a final note on his desk at home for his maid before leaving to commit suicide, and this is what it read: "Human life is limited, but I want to live forever." And it's this nihilistic sentiment that I think is the central theme of everything that Mishima has done. Okay? That incongruity between what he wanted and what he thought was possible in this life. So here's some pictures of Mishima. The one at the top right of your screen is not real. He practiced seppuku throughout his life and had photographs taken of him acting out seppuku, so it seemed like he was planning this for a long, long time. Mishima's writings and the films that he's associated with are important touchstones that remind us of the long, difficult, and always unfolding path that leads in the direction of self-understanding. Just as Yukio Mishima was, until the moment of his death, bound toward Mishima, so too are the rest of us bound toward our own unique identities. Perfect self-understanding, the kind that requires no further struggle, suffering, or effort, is a useful ideal that encourages us to pursue progress in life. But it is, I think, the process of movement itself, rather than actually reaching the final goal, that's most important. So, thank you. Do we have time to talk?
I think so. What time is it?
That's true.
Yeah, it's 12:15, so we have 15 minutes for questions and
If
answers.
anyone has questions or comments or criticisms or attacks? Any thoughts on it? It was when I was a college Marin student. Yeah, it was when I was in 1982. I discovered Nietzsche and I discovered Mishima, which was perhaps the best thing that happened to me. It's also perhaps the most dangerous and awful thing that can happen to a young man. At that age, I was 17 years old when I started reading him. What grabbed me about Mishima was my resonance with his struggle to overcome his weakness. I identified with the kind of vulnerability of, a young, sickly kid who wanted to be strong. And, reading Mishima, that's what I saw. I saw someone who was, who felt insecure, who felt like, he was weak, and he wanted to overcome that. He wanted to become stronger and stronger. I think the danger for young people when reading someone like Mishima or Nietzsche is that sometimes that can be taken in the direction of a kind of zealotry, which is where Mishima went. Now I'm in a position, which I think is kind of strange, where I'm older than Mishima was when he was writing, and I see him as a scared young man. That's how I see him now, from my perspective. And so he's been with me my entire life. He helped me to be strong when I was young, but by thinking about his books and meditating on his philosophy, I think he's also helped me mature. Any other questions?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Last?
In common arts and an understanding, a simple is usually shown as something that someone does in penance for tremendous failure. I failed, whatever it is. They would then be forced to, out of a sense of honor, to commit seppuku because of this failure. How did Mishima reinterpret this as something to strive for?
Amongst Mishima scholars, this is one of the big mysteries that's debated. What was this seppuku about? What was really going on? There are a number of speculations about this. One speculation is perhaps the most literal and simple one, is that Mishima wanted to overthrow the Japanese government. He wanted to bring the emperor back after World War II. And when he failed, he killed himself. Okay? That makes it sound very cut and dry. However, he didn't really have much political interest earlier on in his life. His interests were more aesthetic, and he was fascinated with Japanese culture itself. His nihilism, the philosophy of nihilism that he was developing, seemed to be pushing in this direction, independent of any sort of, political beliefs that he might have. So, a second possibility here is that the failure that he was addressing with this seppuku had to do with the failure of his own perfection in life, that he was striving to be perfect and strong. In Sun and Steel, he talks about this literally in terms of the body, how in bodybuilding and lifting weights, he was trying to build this completely egoless sort of body, which would be like a perfect statue. But it's going to die. It's going to decay. And so when he reached a certain age, he thought he didn't want to watch this decay. His perfection had slipped away. And so seppuku may have been a way of addressing that issue. Other people say he was just a showman. He appeared in big Hollywood movies, not Hollywood movies, but big production Japanese movies. There's a movie called Black Lizard that's kind of a cult movie. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that, where he plays a gangster He was always like playing gangsters and tough guys in movies. He, made his own movie, Patriotism, in which he, depicted seppuku. So a third possibility here is this has nothing at all to do with politics or with philosophy. Maybe this is just Mishima putting on a show. Maybe that's what he was doing. My reading of Mishima's life and his work is that he wanted to kind of bring to a culmination his life in some way. It didn't have to be seppuku, but perhaps this was a culturally familiar way of romantically bringing his life to an end. So it's a mystery, but there are a lot of different sorts of speculations on what was going on here. Of course, there were people like, I think it was Kawabata, was a friend of Mishima's who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and I think he said that Mishima must have been crazy. But of course, Kawabata, he also committed suicide. He didn't do it through seppuku, but I think he took an overdose of pills. One of the things that fascinates me about Mishima is my wife's mother was from Osaka, and she remembers when this happened. And she reported to me that the reaction in Japan was ambiguous. That on the one hand, you had this shock that in 1970, someone was carrying out this medieval ritual, which everyone thought was relegated to history books, and that it just seemed bizarre, weird, and insane. On the other hand, because it was part of the cultural heritage of Japan, people also had this weird respect for what he had done. So there was, this kind of uncomfortable ambiguity about the whole thing.
So he committed suicide in 1970,
Correct.
and we can assume feelings about homosexuality in Japan were pretty negative at the time.
Okay.
How do you, as a scholar, kind of help us understand if, let's say he was gay and he committed suicide because he hated himself, because he, I think that's another, when there's lots of gay and lesbian kids who kill themselves because they just hate, they just see it as such a problem. How can you help us understand that? Because 1970 is a long time ago. Now we would say to a kid who's gay, good for you, this is a gift from God, or something like that. Not everyone would say that.
No, that's another good speculation here. Perhaps it was his conflicted, feelings over his own homosexuality, which led to suicide. I suppose that's possible. I don't think so in his case, and this is part of the whole theme of the book. What makes him an artist, what makes him interesting, is the sort of struggle and the distress that he's going through. If he was well-adjusted, if he accepted, his sexuality as normal, he wouldn't have produced the sort of work that he did. There wouldn't be movies about him. There wouldn't be scholarship. Well, there may be scholarship on some books if he did write those, but those books themselves, if they're rooted in his own internal distress, those wouldn't have been produced. And I have to say that that's what I love about Mishima, is that struggle, is that despair that he's trying to work through. The advice you give to someone, I guess the advice, this is rough. Because the advice is, I suppose, if your aspiration is to be normal, then don't go down Mishima's path. Don't do this. If the aspiration is to be a twisted genius and to be a great artist, then twisted geniuses and great artists, they have to struggle with all of these things. They can't rest satisfied with them. I don't know, does that make some sense?
It helps, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, the reason why a lot of us are so fascinated with Mishima is precisely because he was troubled and because he didn't accept himself. And he wanted to be something that he couldn't be. Yeah. And that includes also had these male lovers over the course of his life that he wasn't ashamed of it, didn't seem in public. I mean, this was pure, it was really public. He would have photographs of himself taken with his male lovers. He was very public about this. There's a book, if you're into Mishima, a book called Ordeal by Roses, which he commissioned, and it's a big book of photographs of Mishima, some of them quasi-pornographic, and he didn't seem to be ashamed about this at all. Yeah.
Interesting.
So.
You mentioned that there can be like relativism that comes with being a young philosopher. Like, what advice would you give to a young person who's interested in this sort of ideology, but maybe wants to avoid some of the more depressing consequences of dwelling on it?
Right, I didn't catch the first part.
What advice would you give to a young person who's interested in this, but maybe from your perspective as an older person, maybe you have insights into how they could pursue these ideas without becoming entrenched in the negative aspects of it?
Yeah, I think the most important part of this are adults. When I was a young man, I was all turned around. I was a ball of neurosis and depression and despair. One of the things that made it really, really difficult to get through that was that when I talked about it or expressed myself to adults about it, they told me, don't talk about it. Don't think those things. Don't write those stories. And kind of like Mishima's father, I think. I think that teachers and adults, parents, leaders, they need to listen to young people that are involved with these sorts of feelings, and be honest and true with them, and encourage them in being creative. Because I think the creative outlet, in the case of Mishima, the creativity got merged with life. But for most of us, our creativity, it runs parallel with the rest of our life. So it's not like you have to act out all of the things that you write about or that you think about. And I think that's more healthy. And so, I would say that, for young people, you got to seek out someone who's sympathetic, to your struggles and your concerns. You want to, sit down and listen to you and encourage you to write or to make movies, to paint paintings, and to be expressive that way. I mean, does that make sense? Any other questions, thoughts? I'm not sure about that. It's not one of the books that I consulted when I was writing the chapter. I'm sure it must be. I mean, Mishima's, he was rumored to be in line for the Nobel Prize at one point. So, I mean, there's enough interest in him that I would be surprised if his earlier works are not available. Any other questions? Tony.
It seems like the fundamental metaphysical issue here is not that Mishima or other nihilists think there's no meaning, but feel a distance between themselves and meaning. In other words, they're failing to achieve it, which seems very similar to what, for example, Augustine felt. Or any Christian in their distance from God. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, in a couple of philosophy classes this semester, we talked about Kierkegaard in this regard. So Kierkegaard, the Christian, talks about that incongruity between lived life and the aspiration towards God. And I think that is a type of nihilism. I don't think nihilism is incompatible with religiosity. I think there can be religious nihilists. Oftentimes you think of a nihilist as being someone who is happy in rejecting, all values. But I don't think that quite characterizes, serious philosophical nihilists. For me, the philosophy of nihilism has to do precisely with the incongruity between the ideal and the real, and the desire to overcome that incongruity, but also the conviction that that's an impossibility. To me, that's the definition of nihilism that I work with. Yeah. And you'll note that, from that definition, there's a kind of what I call an ontological dimension to it. There's this distinction between the real and the ideal. And then the questions about moral nihilism, is anything worth doing, is there anything that's right or wrong, kind of they piggyback on that distinction. Because if the ideal of goodness is something that can never be achieved, then everything in our lives is a relative failure, or relatively immoral in that regard.
Which raises the question of why he would put out so much energy towards an ill-fated goal, or what he saw as ill-fated. Because clearly, he wasn't a guy who sat around and just cried in his tea.
No.
He had a tremendous amount of energy.
Well,
So how do you justify putting out that kind of energy if you don't believe it's going to lead anywhere?
he's what Nietzsche would call an active nihilist. Nietzsche made a distinction between passive nihilism and active nihilism. The passive nihilist follows one line of reasoning. Since the goal is impossible to reach, life's unfair, don't like this world. The active nihilist takes the opportunity to just start doing stuff. Since nothing is ultimately right or wrong, it becomes liberating. There were some students in philosophy classes who had that exact reaction. We were talking about nihilism, that it had a liberating effect on them. So Nietzsche would fall into that second camp, or Nietzsche would fall into that second camp of the active nihilist. Is there ultimately any reason why he's doing the things he's doing? No reason other than to jump into the work and move for life. Yeah. I guess we're out of time. It'd be nice to talk even more, but thank you very much for coming and listening.